Welcome to ProdSec Decoded, the podcast where we explore the evolving world of product, security, and AI. I'm Chiradeep Vittal.
And I'm Pratik Chaudhary. We are your hosts for the show today.
Today's guest is a true visionary in the open source world and is someone I've had the pleasure of working with in the past, David Nalley. Until recently, he served as the president of the Apache Software Foundation, where he represented ASF at critical venues, including a White House Virtual Summit on Open Source Software Security, a Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, and at the United Nations OSPOS for Good. He currently leads open source strategy at AWS and also serves on the board of directors for the Internet Security Research Group.
In this episode, David shares his perspectives on open source and its security in the AI era, from dependencies to governance and maintainer burnout, to how AI-generated code challenges long-standing assumptions about trust and code review. We also dive into the messy definition of open source in the LLM world and why new licensing models might be needed. David's insights are a must-listen for anyone building in today's fast-moving AI-enabled open source software landscape. Let's dive in.
David, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. David, we worked together at Citrix, incubating the Apache Cloud Stack project maybe 10, 12 years ago. At that time, our engineering team was pretty clueless about what it takes to build an open source community. And yeah, you guided us through very expertly and very patiently. And in the end, the process was quite smooth, and Apache Cloud Stack today is still a thriving community. You had an incredible journey since then. You've been at the helm of open source strategy at AWS and the Apache Software Foundation. Can you share what originally drew you into open source and how that journey has evolved with the rise of cloud and AI?
I can. I do want to call out, Shirley, that it feels like it's been about 15 years since we did that. I was actually thinking about that yesterday, that cloud.com and then the Cloud Stack acquisition and it all happened in 2010 and 2011. So a little bit more than 10 years ago, but that means I'm just getting older. So, I got into technology as a sysadmin, and one of the things that I discovered about the particular geography that I was living in was that I thought I would struggle to have access to really fun problems to work on. And I'd been introduced to a number of open source tools, everything from operating systems like Linux and BSD to actual applications. And then, of course, small little tools that just made my day-to-day life a little easier as a sysadmin. And some of those represented interesting problems, either interesting in terms of the impact that they would have or interesting from an engineering perspective, because it required you to think about how to solve really fascinating technical problems in unique and novel ways. And so for me, open source opened up a world of problems and puzzles that I got to work on that I didn't imagine that I would have based upon where I was geographically in the world. And so I started out, my early contributions were to sysadmin tools or to tools that I found interesting. So one of the first that I worked on was a project called Open Groupware, which, as you might imagine, was an open source groupware solution. And I worked on some other open source projects as well, but that quickly led me into a community called the Fedora Project. And I contributed to the Fedora Project for many years, doing everything from writing documentation to packaging software to serving on the Fedora Project's board. And so, but open source originally was a way for me to go find interesting problems to work on, and also to solve some of the problems that I was facing as a sysadmin.
And do you think your role or your perception has changed with the rise of cloud and AI?
I don't think so. I think there are still lots of interesting problems to solve. I think some of those problems have gotten more complex. when I started out as a sysadmin, one of the things I was looking at was how do I automate the provisioning of a server? And for the most part, that's a solved problem now. And so but the problems that we're trying to solve have moved to how do I observe what's actually going on in an application that's running at scale on ephemeral instances across the world? Or how do I troubleshoot or improve performance on this incredibly distributed application? And so I don't think the problems have gone away. I think they've changed in nature a little bit, but at the end of the day, we're still focused on solving problems.
Yeah. And with speaking of that complexity, I think it's just the nature, like you said, distributed systems, etc., just increase. And I think AI brings a uh, particularly new twist to the kinds of problems we're seeing. And I think, as it turns out, these LLMs are still banking on open source projects either to generate code or even to run on the infrastructure. So, how do you see this current state of security governance in the open source components used by AI?
So, I would say that most of the industry still struggles with good security governance, particularly of dependency. Do you remember you're a Java developer, so do you remember Log4Shell
Of course, yeah.
from a couple of years?
It was
Yeah, so Log4Shell, which was a vulnerability that kind of rocked the world, and so one of the things that came out during Log4Shell, this ironically is the only thing I've ever said that has been noteworthy enough to garner me any kind of mainstream press attention. But when we were looking at Log4Shell, incredibly visible campaign to try and fix the problem. The updates to the Log4j software were made and published to patch that within about 10 days. And so really fast remediation of the security problem in the software itself. But months after the fact, 30% of all downloads of Log4j from Maven Central were for a vulnerable version of Log4Shell. And so I think the industry at large has neglected a lot of the governance around curating what actually comes into their code base as a dependency and then keeping up with it so that they understand what the current state of that software is, whether that is that it has vulnerabilities in the software that have been patched and need to be updated, or in some cases, the software's been abandoned and nobody's paying attention to it. And I think both of those are places that the industry has struggled with in terms of keeping track of it. I've worked for a number of different software companies in my career, and one of them, I remember distinctly having a conversation with the CEO of that company, and he was convinced that their software contained 5% or less of open source. Maybe they got up to 10%. But when we would go and look at some of the flagship products, they would have 850 open source dependencies or 1,200 open source dependencies. And that's a really, really difficult set of dependencies to have to manage for, because you're talking about a lot more complexity than the software that you're actually writing in terms of managing that kind of attack surface.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think on the supply side, the open source community that's developing the software, quite often it is to scratch their own itch. Suddenly it becomes very popular. And they may not have thought that, hey, it's going to be used in the world's most critical infrastructure. Do you think there's a opportunity or a chance to improve the tooling and the scrutiny that goes into open source, especially in this ability of AI to scan code and check for vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think you're right. So first, the people who are building a lot of open source software have no visibility into how it's consumed or how it's used. one of the shocking things that came out from Log4Shell was that the software was being used in lots of hardware devices that I had never even considered. One of them was phlebotomy machines and refrigerators. And so like I had never considered that a phlebotomy machine might need a Java logging framework. Maybe I should have had more foresight into that. But a lot of the open source software is meant to solve a problem in a point of time. And because unlike commercial software, there's no contractual relationship. You don't have to go ask anyone for permission. And many times the open source project doesn't even control the distribution point. So people consume that software from a Linux distribution or from a package repository like Maven Central or NPM. And the actual authors of the software have no idea who's consuming it or why. I also think that software developers in general are pretty inventive in repurposing things and using them in novel ways. And so finding a piece of software that'll save you some time and solve some problems is useful and in many ways is a panacea for software development because it allows us to create things so much faster. So all of that to say, I completely agree with the problem statement that you've got people creating open source software and they don't know how it's used. And that means that it's really hard for them to completely understand the attack surface that some of these libraries are being exposed to. I think that the first challenge really is curation. And I think that the software industry as a whole has done a poor job of that. And so if I were looking at solving the first kind of sets of problems, it would be to keep me out of trouble. Don't let me choose dependencies that aren't well maintained, that don't have good hygiene. I'm also amazed by the number of dependencies that I see consumed by software developers that aren't really intended for widespread use. Again, it was somebody who was scratching an itch and they released something on GitHub and it solved somebody's problem and then someone else noticed it and adoption took off. And so, if I were looking at how AI could help me make better choices from a dependency perspective, it would be to save me from the random surfing of GitHub to try and solve my problems with libraries of unknown quality.
That's yeah, I certainly hope that comes about. And as someone leading developer experience, I know that's a new or recent job change for you. Have you noticed any shifts on how developers build with AI tools, and does that impact security at all?
Well, I mean, I have lots of fear around vibe coding because that actually feels a little more like YOLO mode.
Mhm.
And so I've got some concerns around that. I absolutely think the way that developers create software is rapidly changing. I don't know that we're in an end state now, but when I think about things like, you and I both worked on CloudStack, for instance. When I think about how CloudStack was created, developed, and evolved over time, I think that if you were looking at the macro level today, you would say AI is not really changing anything. It's speeding things up, but it's not changing it. But I think it's insidious because I do think that there is an evolution happening in how developers create software. And I think one of the things that developers are going to have to get much better at is to spend more time thinking about what they're actually trying to achieve and how they should go about solving the problem. Because AI speeds things up and it makes it really easy to go try things and come out with something at least quasi useful. pretty easily. Like I'm watching some folks participate in some hackathons right now, and they're doing single prompt game generation, and they're creating text-based games or things like Pong with effectively one really well written prompt. And that's amazing. And I admire the fact that the technology has been able to evolve to the point where that is possible. Because when I started my early adventure writing software, I was never very good at it. But especially in this time period, I learned to program by copying samples out of a hardback book in BASIC. And that's how I learned programming, was basically what you would call the hard way of copying and learning from my mistakes as I was effectively transcribing a hardback book into a computer. And so the speed has definitely increased. I think that's a big change. But I think that especially as we get past novel solutions that people are creating in a prompt or two, I think that it's going to require folks to spend a lot more time upfront thinking about what they're actually trying to accomplish and how to accomplish it, and to think about how the tools change their life cycle. And I'm seeing a lot of these tools being quite innovative, especially as we get into an agentic time frame where it's not just chat as your primary interface. You're having agents with a specialized lens on the task that they're creating. And so you may have multiple things going on in parallel. And I think that changes the way that we have to conceive of and work with tools when we're building software, because it used to be almost a little transactional when we thought, okay, I'm going to go build this feature. Let's think about how this feature should look. And you might spend weeks working on a feature, and now you can have a number of agents that are doing things like writing documentation as the software is being written, and writing tests, and all working in parallel. And I think that that's something that we're not quite ready to deal with, because that effectively turns the developer into not just the developer, but also the manager of all of the other teams, making them more of a quarterback. I think it does. I'm curious what your view is. You've got a different lens than me. What's your view on how AI is changing the software development lifecycle?
Yeah, I've certainly used single prompt to feature myself. In fact, recently I was trying to use an open source component written in TypeScript, and I'm not very good at TypeScript at all. So I wanted a new feature, so I submitted a pull request, and in full disclosure, largely written by AI. And I wrote the tests and everything else. And it is remarkable the pushback I got, even though I didn't say it was AI. Um, the AI did not understand the original developer's intent, like how to structure and lay out the code. And so we got quite a bit of back and forth pushback. I thought that was good, because you don't want people submitting YOLO code into open source either. But what do you think of that? Let's say somebody came up to Apache Cloud Stack and said, here's 10,000 lines of YOLO code. There's a new hypervisor I'm supporting. Should they take it, or what should their reaction be?
I think, and I've had this conversation with a number of open source projects. The constraint isn't now, and I frankly, I don't think it ever has been, the writing of code. The actual constraint on development in open source has always been people's ability to review it for quality and security. And so you might be able to generate a 10,000 or 100,000 line patch set, but the real constraint is, can somebody review that? And you see a lot of open source projects today who want really small, almost atomic commits to come in so that things can be reviewed. And I think that's a good practice. I think one of the things we're going to end up having to do because I think there's a lot of code that is being written by AI of varying qualities. And that's not a reflection on the tools or the open source project, but that's really a reflection of the people who are wielding the tools and whether they're spending time to vet it. But I think we're going to have to build better reviewing tools. Like code generation is not the end state that we should be searching after. I think it's going to be the analysis and vetting of code that's coming in from a security lens or from a software quality lens. And I think that's missing. If I were if I were talking to a project today, I'd say, hey, people are going to be using these tools. You're not going to stop people from using the tools because it does speed them up. The real question is, how are you going to deal with the huge influx of contributions? Because if people see a problem and now they have a tool that will speed up code generation, you're going to be getting a lot of it. How do you keep up with it? What's your strategy for that? And I don't think that open source projects should lower the quality bar. If anything, we should be leveraging tools to increase the quality bar. But it's very much a concern, and I'm worried about increasing maintainer burnout from these open source projects because I'm putting when I'm playing with some of these tools, I'm putting together applications and that would have taken me weeks in the past. I'm able to do that in an afternoon, and that is speeding up one portion, but that means that the constraint remains reviewing that code, and I think that's a real challenge for open source projects. I don't think there's a great. I see lots of people celebrating that they can create code. I'm not seeing lots of tools that celebrate that they can review code really well.
Yeah, it's absolutely echoes my feeling as well. Excuse me. Are open source organizations like Apache and Linux looking into providing or investing in these kind of review tools which help the community?
I think there's definitely some interest, and I think so when I was running the Apache Software Foundation, when I was the president there, we were definitely paying attention to what does continuous integration and continuous delivery look like in this new environment. And there's a little bit of concern that for open source projects, that effectively becomes an unfunded mandate, because now we've got, if I'm euphemistically saying, the machines are now creating lots of code to be reviewed. And so now we need to spin up lots of testing and evaluation, which is equally expensive, if not more so. And so we essentially have a situation where the machines are churning out tons of code, and there is suddenly the need to have machines reviewing lots of the code. And how do you manage that expense? Because most open source projects are not well funded in the commercial sense. They may be at a place where they may be at a well-respected foundation, whether that's Eclipse or the Linux Foundation or Apache, but that doesn't mean that there's the same kind of funding that you would expect. And so I think that you would expect of a commercial project. And it's, it's a little scary, even pre-AI, just how much that continuous testing, the continuously running tests every time a pull request came in would spin costs up. So even if you're just talking about maintaining the status quo of testing, your testing costs have skyrocketed because now people are creating more change sets, which means more testing has to run. I'm not aware of anybody right now that has actual production AI review. I see lots of people paying attention and looking for where it's headed, though. But I think we're still early days in that.
David, maybe keeping on the theme of AI, but switching gears slightly into LLMs and the open source, the definition of open source, as well as maybe some of the licensing things. The word open source in the LLM is thrown around a lot. There is people just maybe open up their APIs and call themselves open source. Sometimes they just put open weights and call themselves open source. Training data, nobody really opens up, but model architectures, maybe some of them open up. So maybe I'd like to get your thoughts on this concept of open weights versus open source, and maybe just to hear your perspectives on whether in the LLM world, does open source, the definition of open source, does it need to change, or things are fine as they are and people should call themselves open weights as opposed to open source?
I think there's a lot of hype around the idea of open source AI, and AI systems, which I'm going to use as a really large generalization for LLMs and things like LLMs, maybe they're a lot more complex than software. Software is relatively simple. There's source code, which ends up being compiled into object code, and those are really your two modalities for software. Like you have source code and you have binary executables, and so it's relatively simple to think about licensing from that. And I also think that it's important to think back, when we created open source licensing, it was I say we, when the open source community created open source licensing, because that does predate me a little bit. It was to work around constraints introduced by copyright. And the focus was on letting people help each other. Matter of fact, if you look at the 4 freedoms, they explicitly call out the purpose is being able to share and help your neighbor. And so I think when you look at open source from that perspective, that's pretty telling. But I also think that there's this idea of being able to study and learn from what's been built. And you'll see that in things like the 4 freedoms, that access to source code is a prerequisite for some of the freedoms. And so I think that is a useful first framing. A lot of what I hear described as open source actually doesn't really resemble open source software to me. There's restrictions on field of use, or restrictions on classes of people or entities that can make use of it. And that doesn't feel very open source to me. And I think we're in a situation where open source has been really successful as a development methodology, and effectively open source software has become a public good, and a public good that take for granted. And so in the rush to make these systems, these AI systems, available to people, I think that folks want to share it broadly. They want to help other people, including their neighbors, and let them take advantage of it. And so I think there's some confusion and that, but also AI systems, like I said a moment ago, they're a lot more complex, right? You start with data, or in the case of an LLM, you start with data and transformers, and you end up on the other side with weight and models, and it's not quite analogous directly to the simplicity of I've got source code, which I will use a compiler to build into object code, and even that's pretty deterministic. And moving from deterministic to probabilistic means that you might not have the same outcome when you run the same things through a system that builds models. And so I think it's complex. I know that there's been a lot of additional complexity because of figuring out what elements you need to qualify something as open source. And so there's certainly been work on definitions of open source AI out of the OSI, the open source, basically the stewards of the open source definition. So the open source initiative has maintained the open source software definition for decades now, and they've created an initial version of the open source AI definition. The Linux Foundation has created a similar one, and I actually liked what Steve at Redmonk said, which is there probably can't be an open source LLM or an open source AI, because what we're used to, especially if you're deeply involved in the semantics of open source, what you're used to in terms of that, you can't easily replicate with these probabilistic systems. And so I think that there's actually, I think there's actually some gap. That doesn't mean that the term open source won't be overloaded and it won't be used, but I'm not sure that it's directly applicable. I think part of that is going to come down to just how much can you share about how they were built, how much can you learn about how they were built, and how much can you then go in and change and evolve things. And I don't think that we will end up with LLMs being the final stage of development and the final output in terms of models and weights being available and having freely redistributable APIs or even freely redistributable models. I think this topic is so complex that there's probably a new way of thinking that we're going to have to get to around models themselves.
And you did touch upon the licensing concept and maybe double clicking on that a little bit more. I
Yep.
mean, there is obviously Apache 2.0, GPL, and other licenses. So maybe want to get your perspective on how should open source foundations think about licensing? Is there a new licensing paradigm that should come about for these AI systems, or will existing licensing can be used for these?
It's a good question. I think I think frankly most open source software licenses were already straining because they were explicitly written for source code. And so you have things like documentation. And I think most of the open source software licenses did a poor job of acting as a license, even for documentation. Now, not an attorney, don't even get to play one on the internet, but you know, when your software license has things like an explicit patent grant, how does that work for documentation? And so, yes, I think you'll end up seeing new and interesting licenses. As a matter of fact, there's been a couple announced recently that are explicitly licenses around, are designed to be for the model. I actually think the Linux Foundation just released one in the past couple of months. And so I do think that we will start seeing some new and interesting licenses for model that are going to be model specific. And in part, that's because the software licenses were written really for source code and don't do a great job when you try and change modalities.
And how do you see we discussed the increasing load on maintainers from AI generated code? What changes? And one, of course, as security practitioners, we worry about the security of this contributed code as well. And so, from your perspective, what changes would you like to see in this ecosystem of open source to improve the reliability, the security, and the availability of open source?
Yeah, I want to call out that I think it changes the dynamic open source, and it probably in other places as well. But you talk about this with your TypeScript contribution, right? Where you understood, or your LLM did not understand the original author's intent. And I think that a lot of open source today and historically has been built around individuals working towards common goals and understanding that almost implicitly. And that's one of the things that I worry about changing is now instead of having a shared common understanding in a community, you have tools that are effectively making assumptions based upon the input to them. And when an open source project has a thriving community, there's a high degree of trust between participants, especially among the maintainers. And I'm not sure that translates well into AI generated things. I think that's one challenge that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with is how do we convey purpose, intent, direction so that everyone using lots of different tools is working in the same direction. And maybe that's part of the change in the software development lifecycle is that we have to be more explicit about that rather than assuming that we and all of our tools understand that direction. So I think that's probably one of the things I think that needs to change is I think we need to recognize that those things that we could get away with them being implicit because we'd have conversations with them on IRC or conversations about them on IRC or on a mailing list or on Slack, that we're going to have to be very explicit so that the tools start understanding what's expected and what the direction and intent is. I do think we're going to have to figure out how do we improve review? How do we scale up reviews? And then is it something that we trust or is it just another step in the continuous integration testing platform that we still have to do lots of manual verification? I think that's something that's going to be decided on a project by project basis and probably changes over time as tools improve. If you told me 3 years ago that I would have a tool that would write an application and I would only briefly peruse what it created, I would find that unfathomable. And I think maybe in 3 years' time, we might see similar shifts in review.
David, as we wrap up, just want to get your thoughts on, or any kind of advice, any parting thoughts that you have for leaders who are trying to build in this complex world of vibe coding and AI and all the other things, including open source and etc. So any parting thoughts that you have for them?
Yeah. I think my sense is that the fundamentals haven't changed. They've only sped up. So a lot of this is, still a focus on curation of what you're taking as a dependency, making sure that you have systems in place to help you understand what's going on in all of those dependencies. Like you took those dependencies because they sped you up, but that also means that you have to have systems in place to be able to monitor what's going on with your dependency set. And then I think I would say you cannot ignore AI. I think there's a lot of folks who are almost avoiding the conversation because it's different than what they're used to seeing. And I think that's a bad take. I think the question is, how are you going to use these tools to increase your quality and speed up things? Because the change is coming, and it really reminds me of some of the changes that we've seen. I think it's moving faster, but the move from functional to object-oriented languages, the move from text editors to actual IDEs, and the actual adoption of IDEs reminds me of this in a lot of ways because it would do a lot of the boilerplate for you, and people said it wasn't a real programming tool; it was a toy. There was a lot of resistance, and you definitely still had to remain in Camp VI or Camp Emac when the early IDEs were coming out. But now I'm not sure I can imagine not having an IDE available when writing code. And I think we're on an even faster timeline than IDEs in terms of transforming how developers work. But I don't think that those are are settled yet. I think we're still very early days in just how different that's going to look. And then finally, I would say you've got to be spending time with these tools, looking at everything that's coming. The space is moving so fast that it's easy to get left behind, and missing 6 months in this industry is crazy. Because we're changing so fast around us.
David, thanks for all that insights. And all right, folks, so there you have it. Another fantastic episode on open source security and developer experience in the world of AI. Thanks again to David for sharing his insights. It's been an absolute pleasure to speaking with you.
Sure, Dave. I really appreciate you reaching out and inviting me. It's been a lot of fun, and I appreciate the chance to get to catch up with you again. We should not wait as long next time for us to chat.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
And
David.
thank you to all our listeners for joining us on ProdSec Decoded. If you found value in today's conversations, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with your colleagues. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the evolving world of product security and AI. Until next time, stay secure.